Friends, today I am going to discuss about the CRUD operation in Angular 7 and Spring Boot. I have already covered for the Spring Boot with CRUD operation, and similar thing what I am going to do, I am going to integrate Angular with Spring Boot, and in this tutorial I will cover only the create portion, that is post operation in Spring Boot. And read operation I have already covered. Update and delete I will cover in next tutorial. To do this, first we have to prepare component for CRUD operation. I have created first registration component, search delete component. This is a two component is required, and search and delete component, this is for the CRUD operation update, delete and read, and I will cover next section. And here I have covered only the registration component, and I have to create the user registrations web service. And because when you are hitting the service, before that you have to go through component, then going through web service, and finally hitting the Spring Boot. And Spring Boot have the URL, so the URL which has been exposed in Spring Boot, to get that URL invoked you have to write the @cross origin. I will discuss later. And here we also need model. This model is the similar to the Spring Boot model, that object through which that data is flowing. And also TypeScript I have to read, and here I have to write the component, FormModule and HttpClientModule in the app that parent.module.ts, so that it can support it. So here I have created two component, registration component, search delete component, and also import the forms module because we are going to submit the data, and HttpClientModule for CRUD operation in invoking web service. And this is the uh, model for the Spring Boot. Here you see that ID, name, email, the list of the properties same will be there in Angular also. Here later you have to add the ID as well. And the routing facility I will discuss in next tutorial. Routing is like for registers, click with the register, it will hit with the register component. And if we search for the search component, if we just don't put anything, it will go to the register component. I will discuss later. Here I, for the sake of simplicity, I just mention for the register component only. And now let me see workflow, HTML and component. And in the cross origin, Spring Boot will expose the web service in localhost 8081, but in Angular by default is localhost 4200. So we have to mention @cross origin before the web service. In the post operation here I have mentioned here. And this is the HTML. Here one interesting thing, that everywhere the same set of property I have to mention: ID, name, email, experience, domain. Here also same HTML, and finally submit. And here I have to use ng model to use that model. How we are going to use that model? To use that model we have to use that reference for that user registration dot id dot name. So this is already defined in the component. So this is user reg and the user registrations, and this reference we are going to use it to hit the web service. And submit the form. And in the component also we have to mention uh, that service, to invoke the service, that user registration service, and is the reference is the service 123. And from the component we are going to invoke that service. That function is the say to registrations, and here I am passing the reference of the model object. And finally from the response dot subscribe, that is asynchronous way, we are getting data, say one variable using lambda. We are getting that response here from the Spring Boot. We are getting the response, and finally it will be storing in the message 123 what I have defined. And after submitting it, it will show in the HTML itself. So you can see the data after submitting. Now next part is that workflow for how that HTML component to component service Spring everything all in one place. Here you can see that this is the HTML for the registration. So list of the properties after submitting, it will hit the component. Here it will invoke that register new function, and from there it will invoke the service. And also I'm passing that user registrations, that is the user registration model object, and finally subscribe. And here in the this message 123 it will store that data. Here URL, reference, and the finally response type will be as a text or as a JSON. And here in that uh, postman call I see that response for that after submitting successfully. So in the HTML also you see that same data. So you see that bracket message 123, you will see that. And the color also changed, it's green, because in the CSS itself I have written simple thing. Since it's in the H1, I have mentioned is the color as a green. And here you see that I have used the URL which has been exposed in the Spring Boot, I have used in the service of the Angular. So this way we can uh, invoke the post operation and store the data in the database. Here in the Spring Boot I have used H2 as a database, so it will be stored in the H2. Now let me see how that component HTML has been embedded in the parent HTML. For the registration component, the selector is app registration, and in the parent HTML I have to use that app registration, and it will embed it. Now see how that output here after submitting successfully, you will see that the same name is visible here in H2 database, as well as when I invoke from the read operation in the Spring Boot, it's also JSON also showing. So this way create operation we have done successfully from Angular to Spring Boot, and finally stored into the H2 database. And here I have used in-memory database. We can use any other database, so we can persist the data. Thank you.